to look this morning at a passage I would call a faith stress test. Hopefully you'll understand what that's about as we get into it. But I was thinking back to a time I had a stress test. Several years ago, we lived in Georgia. I had some chest pain. Doctors tend to take those things seriously. So I called the doctor, and the advice I got was, get yourself in here right away today, or get to an emergency room because you need to get that checked out because that could be something very, very serious. So I chose to go to the doctor, and I guess I had not been a regular patient, so part of the stress that I endured was I had to wait till they could work me in, which was quite a long time. I think by the time they finally worked me in, I'm sure my heart was a bit out of whack at that point. But nevertheless, they checked me over and decided the thing to do as a precaution was to do a heart scan and a stress test. Now, I pause when I think of the phrase stress test. Why don't they have a better name for it than that? You know, because that in itself causes stress. I'm going to go through a stress test. Well, isn't life a stress test? Well, anyway, going to go through a stress test. And so those of you who've been through this, you understand what it's like. So I went in that day, and they hook up all the probes, and I think they did a heart scan first, and they're going to do another scan after the stress test. Put all those probes on, put you on a treadmill. And I was in pretty good shape physically back then, so the treadmill was not really anything I was that worried about. So I get in, and they start it pretty slow. I think, yeah, I can do better than that. And they work it up a little bit and keep monitoring the equipment. And the part that got me, and this must be why they call it a stress test. At one point, I heard them say, let's go to 110%. I was brought up to believe 100% is the most you get out of anything. So I'm thinking 110%. I was remembering back to the space shuttle. I think it was the Challenger. Remember, it's a horrible thing to remember, but you know, they did this throttle up thing, and they would go beyond 100%. You know, and it blew up. So I'm thinking 110% of your heart is not going to be a good thing. So anyway, 110%. And we went through that, and no problem showed up at all. Got all done. They did the scan afterwards, and everything turned out all right. The point of the stress test is not to kill you. The point of a stress test is to find out what might need some attention and some work. I'm thinking this morning, as we look into this story of Abraham called of God to offer Isaac his son, was a type of faith stress test. God tested Abraham not for the purpose of destroying him. It was not for that at all, but to check out his character and to find where things stood with him. Let's look at the first two verses, Genesis 22. Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. He said, take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. I can't begin to wrap my mind around the test that God chose to throw at Abraham. And that phrase, God tested Abraham, stands out to me. God tested Abraham. I don't know about any of the rest of you, but is it not an unsettling thought to consider that God tests his people? Because he not only tested Abraham, there's plenty of precedent in Scripture that God tests his people. And I think by extension that means us. God tests us as his people. A number of passages. You needn't try to turn to them, but I want to share these because I think there's a clear case to be made for the fact that God tests his people. Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 10. I, the Lord, search the heart. I test the mind, even to give each man according to his ways, according to the results of his deeds. I test the mind. Jeremiah chapter 20, verse 12. You who test the righteous, speaking of God, you who test the righteous, who see the mind and the heart. God tests his righteous people. Proverbs 17:3. The refining pot is for silver and the furnace for gold, but the Lord tests hearts. And again, I think it's a timeless truth. God tests the hearts of his people. Deuteronomy 13, verse 3. You shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams. Moses talking about the false prophets that would rise up. For the Lord your God is testing you to find out if you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. That may be more troubling than anything else. God raises up false prophets. He raises them up to test and to see if your heart is fully set upon the Lord your God. And James chapter 1 verse 3, the testing of your faith produces endurance. God is in the business of testing His people. There is no greater example of that than what we read here this morning concerning what God did for Abraham and his son Isaac. Again, like a stress test. God's tests are not meant to ruin us, but to refine us. And I think that's one of the great lessons we'll come back to again and again out of this passage this morning. When God tests us, and most assuredly God does test us, it is not designed to bring us down. God testing Abraham, it was not designed to bring him down by throwing the impossible challenge to him. It was all about refining him, about his character, making him the kind of man that God wanted him to be. And so again, when God tests His people, it is not to ruin, but to refine. So God was very, very specific as He spoke to Abraham, and nothing could have been more difficult than what God called him to do. He spelled it out so very clearly in verse 2. Take now your son, your only son. It's not like he had a bunch of sons he could pick from. Take this only son of promise, whom you love, Isaac. Go to a particular place, the land of Moriah, and offer him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I'll tell you. Now, I doubt there could be any question in Abraham's mind concerning what was to happen. If Isaac was to be offered as a burnt offering, there's a very good chance Isaac is not going to survive the ordeal. So I believe that Abraham clearly knew what it was that he was called to do. And you know, we step back and say, this is a very barbaric thing. How could God do such a thing? How could God even challenge Abraham to offer his son as a burnt offering? And I know it's difficult in this day and age for us to comprehend that, but back in that culture, it was not so unusual. The pagan gods, it was a common practice that parents would offer their children as sacrifices to their gods. Human sacrifices were not so unheard of. I was thinking about my brother-in-law in Canada talking about a time they went to Mexico. And one of the shrines where they used to offer human sacrifices. And talking about the very eerie feeling, knowing that lives were sacrificed to those pagan gods at that time. So again, when God speaks to Abraham and challenges him to offer his son Isaac, the real test is Abraham's heart and his mind. Does Abraham love the Lord God with heart, mind, soul, and strength? Or does he love God's gift of Isaac more than he loves God? Verse 3. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey, and he took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and he split wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. There's so many things about Abraham that we admire and respect. His obedience was immediate. God spoke to him, and the very next day, first thing in the morning, he arose early in the morning. He made all the necessary preparations. He headed off without questioning, without bargaining with God. He headed off to the destination that God had selected. Verse 4, it says that on the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes, and he saw the place from a distance. And Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship and return to you." 3 days. 3-day journey. 3 days that Abraham had to live with what God had called him to do. We can only wonder what was going on in his mind. 3 days that he had with his only son that he loved. 3 days to think about the decision and the implications. And you wonder, what about the conversation? What did he and Isaac talk about for 3 days as they traveled? No doubt Isaac didn't really have a clue what would happen. What about the emotional turmoil in Abraham's life? Were there times when Abraham says, let's forget the whole thing and go back? We don't know any of that, of course. But we have to wonder, if we could put ourselves in his shoes, what would we be thinking about? One writer says that about 20 years have elapsed between chapter 21 and chapter 22 of Genesis. We last saw Abraham in a tent by the well of Beersheba in the wilderness with his son Isaac. There he built an altar and worshipped and called on the name of the everlasting, unchangeable God. For 20 years of blessing and happiness, Isaac had been the delight of his parents' hearts. True to his name, he has brought laughter into their tent. The whole family life centers around this dear boy as he grows up to his young manhood. And suddenly, like a thunderbolt from the sky, comes this word from God. Again, trying to emotionally get ourselves in the story of what Abraham must have been dealing with. So they arrive at the destination, and he says, "We will worship and return to you." The Holman translation, and I think many other English translations, words it a little differently and makes it a bit more clear. The boy and I will go over there to worship, then we'll come back to you. There was a certain confidence with Abraham. He knew what God was calling him to do with Isaac. But yet in the midst of that, he says, we will go worship and we will somehow come back and return. Again, I step back and I admire Abraham because he was that resolute in his belief in the resurrection and the resurrection power of Creator God that even if he goes, as God has called him to kill him and to offer him as a burnt sacrifice, somehow, according to the amazing power and ability of Creator Almighty God, he's going to resurrect him, and we are both going to come back, even if this is what God is calling me to do. It is reflected well in a great faith chapter, Hebrews 11, verses 17 to 19. Summarized in this way: by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promise was offering up his only begotten son. And it was he to whom it was said, in Isaac your descendants shall be called. He considered, I like this verse, verse 19, he considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. That's how strong Abraham's faith was. God can raise him up. If God would do this thing, if this is what God would have me to do, and I know that this only son that I love is the only way for God's promises to be fulfilled, I know that God will raise him up. You talk about the faith of Abraham. It is so well seen there. Verse 6, it says that Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, and he laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife, so the two of them walked on together. Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. And he said, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So the two of them walked on together. And then they came to the place of which God had told him. Abraham built the altar there, arranged the wood, and bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on the top of the wood. Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, do not stretch out your hand against the lad and do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And then Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the place of his son. That scene is so vivid and so powerful. Picture Abraham very carefully building up the altar. And here he's taken the wood and he's arranged it. And getting down to taking Isaac. You know, again, Isaac is wondering, where's the lamb to be offered? And no doubt it truly dawns onto him when Abraham actually ties him up. And again, it's so hard to imagine that scene. He ties him up and lays him on the altar with the knife in hand. You know, boy, the way God does things, the last minute, 11th hour solutions. He no doubt has raised the knife, ready to strike with all the force when the angel calls out at that exact moment. And Isaac is spared, but the stress test of his faith is over. Because the pronouncement is made, I know, Abraham, where your loyalty is. And so then the sacrifice is provided. And in verse 14, it mentions how Abraham named the place, "The Lord will provide," Yahweh Jireh. And what a great statement about Creator God, the God who will provide. We come back to that again in a few moments and savor the meaning of that. The God that we serve as well, the God who provides. And so verses 15 to 18, then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven. And of course, this angel is speaking very much on behalf of Creator God. He said, "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens, as the sand which is on the seashore, and your seed shall possess the gates of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." Time and again throughout Abraham's life, God had spoken and God had promised things to him. Time and again he had made very specific promises to Abraham. Now, once and for all, at the end of the great faith stress test, God has promised that it is so, it will be done. You will have indeed innumerable descendants, and there will be one particular descendant in whom all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because he talks about a particular seed, and the Apostle Paul many years later would clarify that so well in Galatians 3:16. Now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. He does not say and to seeds as though referring to many, but and to your seed referring to one who is Christ. As Abraham did what he did, as he, for all intents and purposes, offered up his only son as a sacrifice, God solidifies all of that by talking about the fact there would be a promised descendant, a particular seed. And what a type it is, because what Abraham did and what God called Abraham to do is exactly what God was willing to do himself and has done for us. And so we have a tremendous appreciation for this story when we know that God is the Abraham, so to speak. Jesus is the Isaac. And of course, the most familiar verse in all the Bible, John chapter 3, verse 16. For God so loved the world, that He indeed gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Him would not perish, but have eternal life. There is a shadow of that great act with Abraham and with Isaac. Again, God did not call Abraham to do anything but what he wasn't willing to do himself. Now, where it gets a little sticky for each one of us, extension, is the application of the story is the fact that we are called, each of us, as the people of God, to similar acts of faith. Jesus says it well in Matthew 10, verse 37. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. The stress test of faith for each of us. Those that we love the most, in particular family, those that we love, if we love them more than our Heavenly Father and His Son, then we have a misplaced loyalty and love. And as difficult as it is for us to comprehend that, God wants us to love Him even more, even as that's what He called Abraham to do, was to declare that he loved his Creator Father more even than that precious only Son. God's gifts to us, I believe, are of no real value until we are willing to give them up so that God might be supreme in our lives. If you want to take away from this passage, I believe that that is it. Those gifts that God has given to us, we appreciate them, we savor them, and we may overvalue them. They are of no real value to us unless we also, like Abraham, are willing to give them up, because God wants our whole lives, our whole hearts, our minds. There is a danger when we hold family, friends, possessions, hobbies, jobs, whatever it is, when we hold those things too tightly, that we value them above our Creator God. We serve a God who provides, and that's one of the real bright spots in this story. The same God that provided for Abraham is the God who provides for us. He is called the God who provides. And indeed, many of us, I think all of us in this room can testify, God has provided many times in my life. And as the Apostle Paul says, not only does God provide, He provides abundantly beyond all that we ask or think, according to the power that works within us, Ephesians 3:20. Is that not our testimony as well? God provides. Can we not say, God has provided in my life? Many times over, God provides. I like the words of the psalmist in Psalm 37, verse 25. He says, I have been young, and now I am old. Yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken or his descendants begging bread. Absolutely love the testimony of an elderly psalmist. Throughout all of my years, from youth until old age, I have never, ever seen the righteous forsaken. I have not seen the descendants, the children of God, out begging bread. God provides. And sometimes we wonder, how is God going to provide? And as I said many times, I think God is the God of 11th hour solutions. It's just like, boy, things are going to go bad real quick, and God comes through in His time and in His way. God provides, maybe not always according to the way that we think and want, but in the absolute truest sense of the word, God always comes through. And so the God who calls us, who also called Abraham to give up, indeed, we are never left lacking by what we give up. Again, I think that God places all of us periodically through a faith stress test, not on the scale of what He did with Abraham, but I believe that God calls us to those things in our way of thinking that can seem equally impossible. And so God many times will call us to something that we don't know any way through or how it's going to work out, but God calls us to a test. In fact, maybe God has called some of us to a test right now. Maybe right now, at this time in our lives, we are in the midst of a time of testing. And we might have to think about, what is it that God is calling me to do right now in my life? What is God calling me right now to give up that I find very, very challenging? Maybe you are in the midst of that kind of a test of your faith right now. Pretty sure that God would not be calling you to offer your firstborn as a burnt offering as He called Abraham. But I think that God is calling each of us to give up something very, very personal. And He's always doing this. He calls us to give up our very life. Even as the words of Jesus that we read a little bit ago. Jesus also says in Matthew 16:25, whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. It's a great paradox of all times. Those who try to get it all together find out ultimately they lose it all when the day of judgment comes, when the kingdom dawns. But those who are willing to give it all up, to give their lives away in sacrifice and in service, ultimately they are the ones who truly find it. And it's kind of interesting how it all works, but that is what God calls us to. The biggest faith stress test of all is to totally surrender our lives to His Son, Jesus Christ. To bind up our very lives, to tie ourselves up in a sense and lay ourselves upon the altar as a sacrifice. And once we do that, the Lord who provides will indeed provide for us as we give our lives in sacrifice. It's very interesting how it works, but indeed it always works. Again, God tests us as He did Abraham. He tests us not to ruin us, but to refine us. And so again, the call for us to consider today is, what is God calling me to do that I might be refined? Not to ruin me, but to refine me. What does God want in my life at this particular point in time? For some in this room, it might be to give my life for the very first time in service and in sacrifice. To turn it all over and say, I have never given my life to God through His Son, Jesus Christ. And that's the ultimate place to start. Just totally surrender your life, your ambition, everything about your life, and say, whatever I figured out, I want to give it to Him, because ultimately by losing my life, I will find it. Beyond that, there may be specific steps He is calling you to take right now in your life. If there's something specific impressed upon your heart and mind, do not ignore His voice or His call. Because what God wants you to give up, He will give you far more in return for what it is that He calls you to give up. Again, what He wants from us, every one of us, is to love Him above everything else with heart, mind, soul, and strength. What He wanted from Abraham, He wants from us. In testing us today, may He find that to be the case. Let's pray.